Forbes Books presents Leading What Matters Most, the podcast that helps you change behaviors, improve performance, and unlock the potential of your people. Here's Phil Geldart.
Hey, Steve. Great to have you on the podcast. Thanks for joining.
You bet. Thanks for asking me on.
And congratulations on your new book. That's great. Leaders Leap. So quite an accomplishment. Looking through your resume, you've had an amazing career. So it's a real privilege to have you on the podcast today.
Oh, thanks. You're very kind.
Steve, I run a company that we train leaders all around the world. So your topic is particularly of interest to me. I'd love to kick off with your thinking. I know you talk a lot about the need for leaders to aim higher and faster. And I'd love for you just to kind of set the stage with that for the audience who perhaps aren't familiar with your thinking. And then I'd like to kind of migrate from that into a little more of the practical things about what does that actually mean within organizations, and we can chat that through. But perhaps give us some context and some of your thinking.
Yeah, well, actually, just quickly, a little bit of my thinking really started probably at least 10 years ago with my work I was doing in retailing. And what I started to notice was that companies that were just making incremental improvement tended to keep losing ground. And so I developed this idea I called remarkable retail, which was in a world where we've got just so much choice, so much information, all sorts of competitors, to even get noticed in the first place, much less actually get deep engagement, loyalty, et cetera. You really have to aim higher in the value you deliver to customers and to create differentiation from your competitors. So it's obviously always been important to have a beauty selling proposition, competitive differentiation. But I think because of just this sheer explosion of choices, the need to aim higher became more and more important. And then as technology continues to improve, as more new products, services, et cetera, come on the market, that need just keeps escalating. So that's sort of the first thing. And then the other part was just the pace of change accelerating. So I started to develop this mantra of kind of aiming higher, moving faster, acting more boldly if you're going to stay to be successful. And then this kind of got me into most people probably agree with that conceptually, but even if they agree with it, they don't always act with that information. So that kind of set me on an exploration to try to understand how is it that very, very successful companies often fail to keep pace. What does this mean for seizing new opportunities to try to stay competitive?
So the concept of aiming higher, certainly as I understand from watching your videos and your book and so on, is a very different mindset in your mind than perhaps it would be in the minds of most folks who think higher is a little bit more than what I'm thinking. Whereas I think in your mind, you're really thinking about dramatic height. So elaborate a little bit on that so that we have a bit of better sense for what you actually mean by higher.
Well, so one thing, and I hate to give you a little bit of a it depends answer, but the subtitle of my new book is Transforming at the Speed of Disruption. So that sort of begs the question, what is the speed of disruption? And the answer is it's going to be quite a bit different depending upon your particular industry and your particular competitive situation. So what I found myself saying is, my guess is like my dry cleaner is not experiencing a ton of disruption. So they don't necessarily need to do anything dramatic in terms of their value proposition or really accelerate the pace of change because the speed of disruption is not significant. But we see lots and lots of categories where the speed of disruption is quite intense. So part of what you have to do is understand, what does it take right now to serve customers in a more powerful way, and position yourself for the future to take advantage. So I often use the example of the U.S. department store industry because it's a place where I spent a lot of time earlier in my career, and that's a place where the department stores like Macy's, JCPenney, et cetera, and we see this in some other markets as well, have been losing market share for 20 plus years. And yet they have not done anything really meaningfully different in terms of their value offering. Much of what they've been doing is try to be a slightly better department store when they actually need to be quite different. So in that case, the aiming higher might be to have a completely different business model. It might be to blow up many aspects of what they're doing today, completely reconfigure their stores, their value proposition. So everybody's going to have to understand their particular situation to see how much distance they have to cover. But I would say the pretty consistent problem, if you look at companies that have either continued to struggle, closing stores, have gone out of business, most of them focused on very incremental change when they needed much more radical change. I mean, that what I would say is my general observation for people that are really struggling to navigate the world we're in today competitively.
Okay. So let me just see if I can repeat back what you said. The aiming higher needs to be put in the context of the business that you're in and the circumstances you're in. It's not sort of an absolute, regardless of the world you're in, you just should always aim higher. Your dry cleaning example is a really good one.
The lens that I often, to get a little bit more practical, the lens that I often will advise clients, or I'm on a few boards and just generally in my writing and speaking, is, hopefully, no matter what kind of business you're in, you have some sort of useful customer segmentation. You have 2, 3, 4 different types of customers, let's say you serve, and you have goals in terms of how many new ones you need to acquire, how you're going to grow the existing business you have with them, how you're going to retain them, how you're going to get them to recommend you. So you'll have some understanding of how you're doing. If you're falling short of what you need to do, then the question is why? And almost always it's because you have not met customer requirements in the way you need to. And that's often because you're just continuing to sort of tweak little things when, the competition has moved on. Now that would be really different. So I'll just use one other quick example. You think about what's happened with Netflix or with Uber or with Airbnb. None of those businesses are incremental versions of the old way of doing things. They are radical departures. They aimed at very, very different in the type of value they were going to deliver, how they delivered it, and they created this enormous distance. So, this is why Blockbuster's not around anymore. This is why the taxi business has lost tremendous market share. So again, you're going to have to look, those are more extreme examples, but ones I think we're all familiar with in terms of where the value has been created in the last, 5 to 10 years.
Okay, that's very helpful. Talk to me a little bit about the role of benchmarking and perhaps looking at your competitors when you're trying to figure out how high that gap needs to be, or how big the gap is you need to close.
Well, I'm a little bit, I don't know if you'd be familiar with, Tom Peters has said benchmarking is stupid. I don't know that I would be that aggressive on it. That's very provocative. But, the problem with best practices in benchmarking is often that, by the time you've identified that benchmark or best practice and go and try to do it, the world has moved on. That's one of the problems with the pace of change being so dramatic in a lot of cases. But I think it's really important to understand very deeply what the customers that you aspire to have or wish to grow and retain demand of you, who they're considering in the competitive set, and being able to identify how you're going to win. I would say the consistent problem is there's often too much focus, and this is a little bit why I use the leap language. There's often too much focus on saying, okay, well, the competition is here, I'm going to close that gap. But the problem is twofold. By the time you close the gap, they may be somewhere else. But also, just because you're equivalent doesn't mean you're going to win the business. If people have already moved to a different supplier, just being the same, it tends to be that people, if they are risk averse and if they like a supplier or a vendor or a retailer, whatever it might be, they're not likely to change just because you're equivalent. So benchmarking is useful input. You just have to be careful not to fall into the trap of just closing the gap or just making, doing a slightly better version of what the winning competition is doing.
It's clear. Okay, can we shift to the executive suite? Because I'm presuming an awful lot of the change and the response to change at a fast enough pace needs to be led from that area. So Talk to me a little bit about, in your mind,
Sure.
the role of the executives at leading this, and then we'll talk about the frontline leader a bit.
Well, part of what part of the argument I make in this book is that there's a lot of cases where leaders or organizations, cultures understand what to do, they just don't do it. And to the extent and I'm not trying to cast blame here as much as I'm trying to hopefully encourage people to take more action. But if you want to put it on the more negative spin, is to go to these leaders and say, what is that's keeping you from either accepting the need for significant change in many cases, but actually taking action. And I think it's a complicated question, but one of the things that I don't exactly lay this out precisely this way in the book, but I think for leaders, individual leaders, often there's this pernicious blend of where their ego gets in the way, where a certain amount of ignorance keeps them from seeing what they need to do or accepting, kind of breaking through the denial, I guess, and where fear keeps people stuck. So 3 of the 7 mind leaps I lay out in the book kind of point to these three areas of how I think, it's very helpful for us to recognize our ego. I mean, I can speak in my own case that my ego issues are often the things that keep me from doing the things that I need to. I think we have to open the aperture in terms of understanding more broadly how competitive forces are being reshaped, how technology is changing things, how customers are evolving in their needs and wants. And then, a lot of times it comes down to being too afraid to take that bold action if bold action is required. So I think it's very important. I really talk about in the beginning of the book that as leaders, we often need to take a pretty harsh, critical look in the mirror to see how we might be part of the problem. But that's also the flip side to that is, we could be part of the solution if we're willing to break through on those areas.
Yeah, the 7 mind leaps are a great diagnostic for trying to figure out what's keeping me from taking those steps. But the issue, and ego and so on, I get, but all of these issues at the moment that you're talking about are really led from the top of the organization. Is that correct in terms of the way you're framing this up?
I think when it comes to, like it or not, I think most times if an organization, whether we're talking about a retailer or an industrial company, or we're talking about for-profit or not-for-profit, big and small, most times if we're going to really transform the organization in a meaningful way, that's going to be led, not exclusively from the top, but largely from the top. So I think it is very difficult. There's plenty of changes and leaps that can be made in smaller ways further down in the organization. So I think some of this advice in the book is very applicable throughout the organization. If we're talking about a real strategic transformation, that's going to mostly come from the board, C-suite level, just practical way. I think that most organizations operate.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. So let's assume that senior group has actually embraced this. They've come to grips with the leaps that they need to make, and they are now trying to implement that rapid change, the reaching higher within the organization. How would you say that needs to be cascaded down, and what behaviors should we be looking for from the frontline leaders who are actually the ones that have to implement the vision that's coming down? I'm trying to move it toward your sort of your line manager level.
Yeah, I don't know if this exactly answers your question, so I'll try to keep it brief. And then if you want to go a little bit deeper on it, I sometimes think about this as sort of a left brain and a right brain exercise. The left brain is to explain, hopefully get buy-in for whatever change you're trying to incorporate. So appeal to logic with facts and figures so that people hopefully can understand and be persuaded that this is the right sort of action. But then there's also the support, the trust that needs to be built. So, you demonstrate through your words and actions and supporting mechanisms, hopefully, that you've got people's back. So a very specific example would be if you're really trying to foster more of a culture of experimentation, more testing and learning, you are signing up for more failure than probably the organization is used to. If people are going to not be encouraged and supported to take risk, if it's career ending to be associated with a project that fails, that's a huge, huge problem. So you have to build mechanisms and incentives and support and training and lots of other things if you're really going to expect people to really step out. So I generally say, you want to make the business case for the change, and that's pretty logic heavy. But then there's the empathy and vulnerability and a lot of other sort of soft skills that have to support the more harder logical pieces of any change initiative. But, it also matters the degree, it matters the degree of change that you're asking people to do. It's also how different is this for the organization. So one thing I often do when I'm working with companies or leaders is I'll ask them whether the culture is fundamentally wired to say yes or wired to say no. And by the way, almost everybody knows that the answer they'd like to say is wired to say yes, but usually the real answer is wired to say no, which is probably a little bit of a bias in terms of companies I end up working with. But if you have a culture that's not used to change, and this is a very big departure, that's going to take a lot more care and attention than a company that is pretty well versed in making change. So, you've got to be sensitive to how big a leap it is. Just declaring you're going to be, a totally different company, we're going to transform, we're going to be really different, like that, those things tend not to work very well.
We do a lot of culture transformation work, and I would agree with you that we tend to say it takes 2 to 3 years before you actually get that transformation in place. So I think I just want to explore a little bit, and maybe you can add a little more color here. It's not simply enough for the senior people to say, we want to aim higher, we want to be faster. Somehow they've got to engage the hearts and minds of the workforce below who have to execute that. Is that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that you have to hopefully win most people over with the logic of why you're doing what you're doing and how critically important it is. But just declaring it has, in my experience, has pretty much zero chance of success. You've got to provide the conditions. In fact, I'm working with, I'm on the board of a company right now where we're going after something. It's not a moonshot, but it's much more aggressive program of growth than they've done before. And part of what we're spending a lot of time thinking through is how do we create the conditions for success? Because just deciding to do it and saying this is a priority is not providing those foundational pieces. So in some cases, it's, do we have enough resources? Do we have new skills in place? Do we have training? Do we have communication? So I don't want to dismiss, and I don't, in this book, I'm not trying to lay out kind of a playbook for cultural change. There's plenty of people, including you and others, that are much more skilled in this arena. But you absolutely have to be very, very mindful of that. What I'm really trying to do is to kind of wake people up to the reality of what is needed if you're going to not only win in the future, but in some cases prevent an extinction event, unfortunately, for some companies that are slow to change. Provide the inspiration, provide some guidance as to what that looks like. But yeah, there's a lot of devil in the details for sure to work through a business case and to create the cultural conditions for success.
Okay, very clear. When you talk about cultural conditions, again, the culture presumably, as you would be thinking about making this shift, is going to have to be articulated again from the executive at the top, that are going to have to say, for us to be successful, the new culture is going to look like this or like that. How would you say that they should go about doing that? Is that working through, as you mentioned, training and communication? Is it about codifying behaviors? How is the best way for them to get the culture to align with this aspiration for dramatic change?
Well, again, there's a little bit of a depends answer, but I think you have to be if it's a big, complex organization. So for example, one of the clients I've been working with the last couple of years, which is a very large retailer with a long history. So people are used to doing things one way, and now it's being suggested they do things in a not completely different way, but a different enough way. So there's a lot of support and infrastructure around putting those changes in place, which is, to your earlier point, this is not a 6-month process. This is a probably really 3 to 5 year process. So I'm in about year 3 right now and have made a lot of progress. But some of it is making sure they have the talent in place. Some people are not, I mean, I hate to be a little bit of too much of this on the bus, off the bus sort of thing, but there's some people that are clearly not prepared for whatever reason to go on this journey. And so not only are they exiting people in some cases or putting people in different responsibilities, they're attracting new talent to the organization because they see that they didn't have the human resources broadly. They have a lot of it, but they need more. So you have to think through your human resource decisions, completely new training and education curriculum, quite extensive, a lot of communication meetings, a lot of coaching and training kinds of things up and down the organization, as well as technology. So, in this case, it's quite elaborate, but they realize that not only is it important to do it, so it requires, it makes sense to put this kind of investment, but they're actually asking people, I think they're being very realistic about how different it's going to be and how hard it is to turn a big organization. If you're in a smaller, more entrepreneurial organization, flatter, whatever, or just you can get everybody in a room, or you're all in the same place, or have worked together for a long period of time, and you're not dealing with people all over the world or what have you, it's a little bit simpler. But, I think people generally, one of the things I say in the book in various ways probably is, I think part of the reality of any kind of change is most people really don't like change. People often say, I don't know if this is your experience, my experience is definitely that people often say they want change, but what they really want to do is keep doing what they've always done, just a little bit better. And, if you need something more significant, that's not going to be good enough. So I think it's fine to admit that we're often afraid of change, that things are scary, and I don't think we have to be coy about it. I think that kind of vulnerability and transparency is super important. So you have to foster that as well. And again, that may not be. I've worked in a couple places where transparency, vulnerability were not encouraged. In fact, they were in many cases actively discouraged. So if you're moving from that sort of situation to a really different one, it's going to take time for people to believe that the leader can say it, but if they don't, walk the talk, and model that behavior for more than, it's not just a matter of doing it in a couple of meetings or for a few weeks. People are going to be skeptical because they've probably been burned by other change initiatives that haven't gone as well. So I think you have to be really realistic about it, and it's getting this balance between being bold but not being reckless. That's one of the things I'm fearful with my leap language, that somehow I'm suggesting everything like this big massive leap kind of all at once. And I think that it's not a Hail Mary or kind of a moonshot. So it's more of an attitude. And then you've got to really get down to how much risk is needed and what's involved with taking that risk. But hopefully you're really leaning forward on it. That's, it is the wired to say yes versus wired to say no. But it's not blow it all up just to blow it up and, declare it's a totally new day and expect everybody's going to be on board and in short order.
I think that's really helpful, Steve, because I think people sometimes think this kind of thing is, wow, Steve has just said we should do this. Let's just go do it, without an appreciation for all the work, all the consequences. So as you lay it out and say, okay, listen, in my experience, it's going to take time. You're going to have to work through the detail. You're going to have to understand. You're going to have to set realistic expectations. I think, Steve, that brings a level of clarity and pragmatism to it that allows people to actually look before they leap, so to speak, and leap in the right direction.
I don't want to say that this idea of leaping is just attitude or just a simple mindset shift. But I do think that there is, the thing, and there's, kind of two sides to this book. There's the kind of negative side, which is advice to avoid being made irrelevant. So it's much more negative. Like if you don't act more boldly, you may be roadkill, so to speak. But there's, so yes, I'm worried about that. And I started my retail career at Sears, which, was once the biggest retailer, most valuable retailer on the planet, now basically doesn't exist. So I've seen plenty of examples of companies that were very, very successful, iconic part of culture that are gone. And so that's just sad. And if I can provide any advice to keep that from happening to some other great companies, I'd love to be able to do that. But the flip side of that is also, so in that case, oftentimes the people reading the book or people I'm consulting to or speaking to, they're already in trouble, right? It could be a crisis. And so I think there's often this, oh my God, we don't know what to do, dramatic sort of thing. But I think more practically and more expansively is, how do you stay at the leading edge of disruption? How do you avoid getting into a crisis? And in that case, you're not necessarily in panic mode where there's this declaration like, before we go crashing into the ground, we've really got to shake things up. And that's sort of closer to death kind of experience, and as a practical matter, often causes people to make kind of desperate decisions. But also you get to a point where your options as a practical matter are foreclosed because you may not be able to attract talent. You may not be able to attract capital. Like there's all sorts of things that make it difficult for companies to transform when they've gotten so damaged. So I'm hoping to say to people, like, definitely avoid putting yourself in that situation if you can. But the positive thing, I think, is to see that if you have this mentality of moving faster, aiming higher, being more bold, being on offense, wired to say yes, however you want to think about it, that gives you a greater chance of preserving your position and perhaps even extending it. So I found, as I'm being interviewed about the book, and some of this is of my own making for sure, is to talk about the negative, like avoid catastrophe kind of part of it. But what I hope people see is this is a more hopeful book to be able to take advantage of opportunities. If you're doing the work, if you're making these mind leaps, you have a better chance of not only protecting yourself, but hopefully actually taking advantage of opportunities, which are out there all the time. And there's obviously plenty of companies that are doing really, really well by embracing some of these principles and other principles.
Yeah, I think that is profound in the sense that these leaps can either help you get better or they can help you stay strong. The principles, getting your ego under control, for example, not being afraid of risk, for example, thinking radically. These things are weapons to help you stay winning. They're not just weapons to help you avoid losing, is I think your point.
Yes, no, that's very well said. And I also think one of the things that's different and perhaps obvious is, if we look at, and I'll just kind of keep this within the retail world, but it's certainly affected other industries. We've had several really transformative ages, you might say. When e-commerce became a thing, that was a massive shift for just about all industries. When smart devices became ubiquitous, essentially, and we became untethered, like that created a whole set of challenges and opportunities. And some people seized them and some people fell behind. 5G, cloud computing, these are very big technical changes that have caused a lot of disruption. Now we're into the generative AI world, which will have also. So I think you can look at that and say, oh my God, I might go out of business if I don't understand this. But you could also say, well, this is going to create a whole set of new opportunities that I may or may not understand right well. Chances are you don't fully understand them. So what am I going to do to maybe let go of, because one of the points I make in the book is, I see this all the time, and I've experienced this a little bit myself, is what's made us successful in the past may not serve us very well in this new world order. In fact, it might actually get in the way. If we just keep doing, the hammer, particular set of nails, whatever little cliche you like. So you can view that as something that's scary, or you can say, wow, this is an opportunity for me to learn new things, to maybe listen to different voices, to maybe try more stuff. to rethink what we're doing, to lean into some new opportunities more aggressively, and that can propel us even further. So I think, there's a little bit of this. Do you have a scarcity mindset or do you have a growth mindset? So I try to appeal, I guess, to both mindsets in the book, but I think what's most exciting is creating something new, not just preventing catastrophe.
One of the things I found really interesting, you mentioned that ego tends to keep us from seeking wisdom in the sense of AI and robotics and various forces that are out there. And I know I'm going to have to deal with them or somehow respond to them, but that's not my area of expertise. But because I'm in charge, I'm supposed to know everything. So chat with us a little bit about the value of bringing in experts to help me get where I need to go faster and higher.
Well, I would say fundamentally, part of what I'm pointing at in the chapter that I go into this in some detail is it's just really the need to be more vulnerable. And I think some of this is probably a bit of a generational thing, and it might even be a little bit of a, kind of male dominated thing, which is, not to let people see you sweat. I was very much taught early in my career that as a leader, you're supposed to have all the answers, sort of a power and control, more almost military kind of, on the top, and then, you delegate down and all that kind of stuff. So I think there's a mentality that's, is probably more characteristic of more of a generational thing. And I think just in general, that can cause a lot of problems. But I think particularly in a world where things are changing very quickly, where it's often hard to understand where things are headed, vulnerability is a superpower. And the willingness, even if you're the CEO or the senior vice president or whatever corner office or title or whatever you might have, to admit when you don't know what you're doing. I don't think that's, it's often perceived as a weakness, but I don't think it's actually a weakness. I think some of the best leaders that I've worked with in recent years are incredibly humble and vulnerable. They say they're willing to ask questions. They're willing to say when they're confused, ask people to say things again, but they're also maybe willing to invite different people into the discussion. So that could be technology experts. That could be people that are diverse in all sorts of different ways, depending upon, what situation you're dealing. It's pretty obvious, I think, in consumer businesses that you can't survive in most cases without attracting younger customers, right? So most businesses are run by older people. So, to say that I don't have any idea what Gen Alpha is going to want, I need to have consultants, agencies, whatever, or people on my staff that can really reflect different ways of thinking. I'll tell you one, just without naming names, but one of the things that was most interesting when I was I was the head of strategy at the Neiman Marcus Group, and our online business was growing very quickly. One of the leaders, when I shared the data that half of our e-commerce sales came from within 10 miles of where we had a store, one of the people on the leadership team said they could not understand why somebody would shop online when they had a store just a few minutes away. And that was because of the way he shopped, and he didn't really understand, busy working moms or, whatever the reason might be that somebody shops. So, that's a really kind of silly example in a way, but he had a real blind spot for that because he just couldn't get why. And the data was overwhelming. And I think a lot of us had the experience of shopping online, even though we could go to a store. But, you need to be using both customer insights and data to inform your decisions, but you also need people with really different perspectives to challenge your assumptions, to sometimes push back on ideas that might have been really great ideas that made you incredibly successful in the past, but may not be so useful today or in the future.
Yeah. It's fascinating because a lot of we're on the people side of transformation, and, executives say, I know what I want. I know how I want the people to behave, but I have no idea how to get them there. So we are not experts at changing behavior. We're great at building bicycles, and they need to, but it's sometimes quite a difficult leap for them to think, okay, we should bring somebody in to help us change the behavior of our people, because why can't we just tell them what to do? Well, it kind of doesn't work like that. And I think it's similar to what you're saying. You need to understand that behavior change, or dealing with AI, or dealing with technology, you may not have the skills in place. That's not a deficiency. It's just an identification of a need that you go out and meet.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think the more, not to turn this into like a mindfulness podcast, but I think the more self-aware you are of what's going on and where you may have blind spots. Is a great book by Adam Grant that I referenced called Think Again. And I think he does a lovely job of explaining some of the psychology behind, confirmation bias and other kinds of things that get in the way of us seeing and appreciating and acting on some things. But I also think, there's from a leadership perspective, I actually just got off a call I was doing with a major search firm, sharing some of how my thoughts in the book might affect hiring decisions. And I said, one of the things that at least has been my experience and frankly has led to whatever success I've had is I'm a pretty analytic guy. I have had most of my success making very logical arguments, taking data, persuading people that my view of the world or my team's view of the world is the right one. So I think I'm fairly skilled, certainly compared to just the average person on the street, around doing things in a certain way. I wouldn't say my emotional, my EQ is necessarily, I think it's better now because I worked on it, but I don't think that was, I was very much into trying to convince people through the force of analysis and arguments. And that's obviously very helpful in many situations, but it's also very unhelpful in other situations. So part of that is having the self-awareness and breaking through your ego around, there are other ways of doing things. Maybe I need to develop some new skills. Maybe my tendency to lean on certain strengths actually aren't strengths in this particular situation. So I've described this book a little bit as, yes, it's a strategy book in some respects, but it's much more of a courageous leadership book, because I think, what I'm trying to do is really call people to take a hard look at themselves, see where they're their own worst enemies sometimes, try to open the aperture, both in terms of their leadership style and who they include in running and driving change, but also being expansive about different ways to execute their business model. So there's both the strategic business piece of it and thinking radically about that, but there's also the thinking more boldly about how we conduct our day-to-day leadership or leading of organizations.
That's great. That's great, Steve. Let me expand on that a little bit with you. If you think of an organization made up of how we manage our people, how we manage our processes, how we manage our tools, the tactics, you sort of have these major categories of people, process, tools, and tactics. How would you say those need to come together if I'm committed to reaching higher, moving more quickly? How do I think about those various levers that I need to pull to be successful?
Well, I think, again, the exact way they play out, I think is pretty situation specific. But what I would offer is, first of all, I think building more agility into all those things is incredibly important. I think, and again, if your speed of disruption is on the slower side, maybe not so much. But if you're really going through a lot of disruption and change, and by the way, one of the things I point out early in the book is a survey that ALEX Partners did, and they have a lot of questions, a ton of really interesting stuff in that study. But the main thing I point to is what percent of CEOs say that their businesses are undergoing a lot of disruption. So it's not just my opinion that there's a lot of disruption. I mean, leaders self-report that they feel that they are going through a lot of disruption. They also report that they find it hard to keep up with it. They don't even know where to start. So there's a lot of nervousness, I think, about how disruption is affecting many, many industries. It's a cross-industry study. So I think that's there. So if you are having to navigate a fair amount of disruption or anticipate you'll have to, then how do you build more agility and speed into what you're doing? Because you just fundamentally have to be more responsive to change. Sometimes you know what that change looks like. So the client I was referencing earlier, they have a pretty clear view. Like this transformation, their work they're doing is pointed against some fairly specific things that they are confident are important in the near future. In other cases, you're going to have, great unknowns. If your business is one that's going to be disrupted by generative AI, you probably don't have a good idea exactly how that's going to transform or how that's going to play out over the next few years. So you're going to lean even heavier on building speed and agility into your processes, into your tools, and maybe even the high kind of people you hire. So I would say you kind of see where you are on that index. That'll guide you to how much agility and speed you need to build into your organization to try to anticipate and be more responsive. But I think the other one in most cases is going to be, how do you build more of a culture of experimentation and just try more stuff? This is one of the other things I point out in the book is, and it's funny, as I've talked about this over the last couple of months with people, I'm getting lots of anecdotes of people saying, oh yeah, this is so true. But when you look at organizations that more consistently and reliably produce a string of innovations, it's most typical that it's not because they've come up with some magical formula that's just a better innovation process. It's mostly that they try more stuff. It's not to say that there aren't better ways to manage an innovation process, and there are some things that will increase your odds of success. But the real distinguishing factor is they're willing to try more things, and the things that are working, they're prepared to double down on them and scale them. The things that aren't working, they stop quickly or pivot. So again, that's a responsiveness, agility kind of dynamic that is part of both the culture, but it's also part of the processes they put in place to manage it.
So as you're talking, Steve, it crosses my mind that organizations tend to have a curriculum. We train people on being good communicators or managing change or, managing projects. We don't typically think of agility as a skill that should be taught and mastered, codified, respected, and even you could add to that your experimentation. So it's almost like we should be adding into the curriculum that we train our folks on this competence around agility and experimentation, because it would then give them tools regardless of the situation, whether it's a process or dealing with an employee or dealing with a customer or dealing with some data coming in. I have a mindset that says I can respond, I can try something new, but I need to respond quickly. And I think that's very neat. This concept of agility not just being, well, I wish we had it, but actually something that we should embrace to help us move more quickly and get higher.
I think so. My last mind leap is number 7 is faster, go, go, go. And it's really trying to be provocative around the need for speed. But that does beg the question, okay, it's one thing to say you want to go faster, but how do you actually do it? And some of it is a mindset, some of it is cultural, but I agree with you. I think we don't, my experience is it actually depends a lot on the nature of the company. So if you're in the certain technology businesses where product development, constant product development is just part of what you're doing, or if you're in social media where you're putting out just constant engineering tweaks, like that is so ingrained into the way of doing things that I don't know whether, because I haven't worked in any depth in those industries, so be a little bit careful about trying to be too specific because I probably don't really know what I'm talking about here. But my sense is that those kinds of companies are so used to having agility as just the thing they do, like they don't even think about it. Just like a retailer is so used to buying and selling merchandise and inventory plan, like that is just what you do. But what I see in retail in particular, but plenty of other industries, is there isn't much agility. There isn't much experimentation. It's quite rare. This idea of having like an R&D budget which you would find in any pharmaceutical company or chemicals company or whatever. Like, that's just the way you do things. When I ask people, what's the R&D budget at a retailer, everybody just looks at me like, we don't have any, I don't even know what you're talking about, right? So I'm like, well, just do you have any money set away for experimentation? And the answer is almost always no. So just by design, they don't have, and that's just one way of building agility in the system. Like, if you needed some money to go try something and you got to argue, you got to cut something else, you've not set yourself up to be particularly responsive and agile. So there's many other examples, but that's just one. So I think, depending upon the nature of how you've competed, you may or may not have any real skill set. And so not only you're not hiring for it, you're not training for it, you're not reinforcing that skill level as something that is a way to get ahead and be successful. So no, I think it's an interesting thing. Yeah, I imagine there are people out there that can teach that the skills and the mindset in a way, but it's definitely absent in many companies that I end up interacting with.
Yeah. No, I clearly, I mean, it's something that I think Eagles Flight would come in and be able to equip you with. But the bigger issue from my point of view is, as we try to implement your thinking, some of these things are very practical. Like, it's not unattainable. There are some practical things you can do. Experiment, be agile, get your ego under control. Don't be afraid of risk. I mean, these mind leaps are not academic. They're very pragmatic, is I think what I'm getting at.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. I hope so. I mean, again, trying to, in a relatively short book, put forth things that are going to work in a wide variety of circumstances isn't easy. So I try to approach it from a high level. And then in some of the chapters, have some study questions that hopefully help people take it from more abstract to more concrete and more directly relevant to their situation. But I think, first and foremost, be willing to try some stuff. Like, it's a very trite thing to say, but you don't have to have all the answers to get started. That's another thing towards the end of the book I try to encourage people to do. It's a little bit better. It's a little bit like, what better time than now, right? Like, you can wait your whole life to try something. So you don't have to have everything figured out from day one. In fact, I think if you think you have it figured out, you've probably wasted a lot of energy, because by the time you actually get down the path a little bit ways, things, conditions have changed. So again, I think that's often just fighting through our fear. When I talk to people about writing a book or starting a podcast or any number of things, there's usually a big song and dance around why they need to study more or practice more or whatever. And yeah, maybe, but maybe it's more important to put something out in the world and see what the response is, and then get a chance to iterate on that. So getting the practice is important as well, particularly if you're in an organization that doesn't have a lot of experience. Like, you're not going to run a marathon, probably a tired cliche here, but I often say, like, you're not going to run a marathon successfully because you say to yourself, I'm going to run a marathon. You do that because you get out there and you start running a little bit at first, and then more and more, and eventually you've got the reps that allow you to do it. But it's not a decision or a thing that you're going to be able to do without practice.
This has been great, Steve. I think if I were just to wrap up kind of 3 points that you really need to be thinking about your own context of your organization so that you apply these principles appropriately. I think the second thing that stands out to me is you really need to be realistic about where you are and take action versus incrementalism. And the third is you're going to need the courage to do it, recognizing it's not just wishful thinking. There are a lot of steps to seeing those visions fulfilled. But if you kind of bear those things in mind, then the mind leaps you've given provide a bit of a roadmap that allow me to optimize my chance for success. I think I'd summarize what you said there.
Yeah, I like that. You put it more succinctly than I did, so I appreciate that.
No, it's good. All right. Well, Steve, again, you are very wise and you've got a lot of experience, and I appreciate you taking the time today. That was great. Thanks a lot.
I enjoyed the conversation. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, you're welcome.
This has been Leading What Matters Most with Phil Geldart. If you want to create a culture that drives performance and develop leaders that inspire and motivate, go to philgeldart.com. Leading What Matters Most is a production of Forbes Books.